black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and this is part 4 of a 4-part series that I've done based on an image that I put in the first show, which says that why do we constantly say that America has never been this subdivided before, and it set me on this path to reiterate again the purpose of. Let me just start with what the Umoja Circle is about. The purpose of it is to correct errors where errors are found, and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fictions when it comes to who we are and what we have experienced as people of African descent. Basically, to ease their consciousness that America, like I've been showing through the last 4 shows, has always been divided. In fact, it was created, like I said in the previous show, to because the founding fathers understood you're going to have various different types of interest groups. So you're going to be divided along interests anyway. So each interest group's going to vie for their ideas and their interests to become law, which will benefit them. And they also understood, because they knew as the population expands, there will be more interest groups. That means that each interest group, like you have competing armies, will compete and check each other or become allies or whatever it is, just like a war. I always use the quote in previous shows which said that war is politics with bloodshed, but politics is war without bloodshed. Let's never forget that, okay? There still be devastation with the decisions made by politicians in Washington and in state governments. Look what's going on right now with all these federal employees losing their jobs. That's devastating to them. It's wiping out the economy of the communities that they live in. You know, one of the richest communities in the D.C. area, when you don't have that government job that you can afford that home, it's going to devastate you. And if you can't afford the house, you ain't going to afford to go to that grocery store where that grocery store owner was benefiting from your paycheck where you go and spend your money there. So it's a domino effect based on the decisions that people in government make. And if you don't participate in this with your vote, making sure that you got the right representation, that's why you got representative, you know, voting is important, okay? And the ramification of not voting is like somebody who's in the middle of a battle not using their guns or their weapons. That's kind of ridiculous, because whoever the forces are that gain the ground and gain the higher levels and all the things that they're fighting for in their interests will not think about you who didn't participate in and your interests anyway. So anybody who thinks that because there's a politician that they're not working for you, well, if you're not making sure that person works for you, if not, get rid of them. If they know that they could do whatever they want, your interest is not going to be satisfied. So if you just say, well, these politicians don't work for us, well, what are you doing to make sure they work? There is a way that this voting works. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's a very important way that you get the right people who represent your interests. And if you don't make sure that they maintain that, then you get rid of them with the vote. It is the weapon of choice for citizens. And if you don't use that weapon, then you'll see whoever's interest is more powerful, more organized, like any organized army, will be the ones that interest is going to be put into law and into power. Okay, right now, the same type of people who were in, if you look through the previous show, who were dominated, which were basically white males, and they were a dominant group that was created by the Constitution, because white men put it together and they put themselves as the dominant class system. And I always say that America is a caste system. Okay, black people have been put in the secondary caste, not class, but caste, and we've been fighting for our rights. You know, one thing about the Constitution, if you get the right representation and if you get the law, you have the ability by the vote to get the law changed to benefit your interest group, okay, or your caste interests. But we've been doing a great job up until the 60s and 70s, but these 80s, 90s, and these 20s, we've been losing deliberately because we became too complacent. We became too complacent. Let me start with an image to show you what it took. Okay, you see this brother. This is an image of a brother in 1966 in a county in I think that's either Mississippi or Georgia. But you see that sign there that says Black Panther? That was a group of dirt poor black farmers who, with the people who were doing the bus drives from the north, who were registering them to vote. This is an organization that they started, the Black Panther Party. The original Black Panther Party, they took that from the Black Panthers in the military. There was a unit called the Black Panthers. But guess what? Who Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party that you might be familiar with or heard about in Oakland took their name from? These folks. We see it with that gun. We were not pushovers. We had to fight for what you are taking advantage of and don't even use today, because they understood that you had to participate in the system in order to get your rights. And like any war, it's going to be difficult. You got to have strategies. And we forgot that. We took our foot off the accelerator. All right, we are a bunch of complacent people and wonder why things are not going right for us as black folks today. Please. And I showed you in the previous show about what Martin Luther King had to go to jail. Rosa Parks, okay, John Lewis got his head cracked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that Bloody Sunday. It took time. People had to take time to do that boycott that went for a year in Montgomery for the buses. And if you sit on your butt and doing nothing, you don't have the right to complain. If you didn't vote, you don't have the right to complain, because it's your fault that the other group or interest groups are in power today and they're pushing their interests, and you think they're not there for you, they're there for their interests. This is how the system works. Let's go on to the next one. Okay, again, like I said, this American caste system called racism is the infrastructure of our historical racial divisions. It is a structure. It's always been that way. We call it racism. It's not an individual thing. It's a system. The political system, the economic system, the military system, the social system, where you have laws that says by that particular interest group of where people of African descent stand, where Native Americans stand, whether we get redlined for where we go in homes, whether we get to use the benefits of the GI Bill after World War II so we can go to the suburbs. All those things require laws, whether state, or federal, or even local municipal laws. And who controls those laws are the people that are voted into office. And if you don't participate in that, you will remain in that particular caste that you say. And black people have to make sure that's what we will talk about, equality, okay, equity. Okay, that's why the DEI program was done, because black people sacrificed in the 60s and the 50s, that the DEI program, not to make sure that they were not qualified people. Black people had to always be qualified, doubly qualified, to survive in that caste system, to even be accepted into schools. So we were always qualified. We were always overly educated, just to survive in a racist America, a segregated and caste America. Okay, so don't let anybody fool you that we were sometimes unqualified, like some of the nonsense is being said today. We've always been qualified, but we had to be overly qualified. But they rather have an incompetent male, which is the upper part of the class, in those positions, because that's how it's always been since colonial times. White men and what they say were law. Let's go on to the next. Today as Americans, we are called to examine and update a social structure called racism built long ago, just like a house. Let's go on to the next one. In politics, the types of individuals who want America to expand civil rights, liberty, and equal access into society are known in the political arena, in the battles that happen there, as progressives, okay? Everything must progress. It was progressives who gave the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment. It was the progressives who had Social Security and things that help you when the bank folds so you get your insurances, always. While those who want to leave this political house just the way it is without any change are known as conservatives. That's why I could never understand black conservatives, because you're conservative in what? After the images I showed in the world that we existed just 2 generations ago, what are you conservative of that, where we couldn't even go into a restaurant, where we had had segregated schools and all these other things, Let's go on to the next one. Yeah, like any old house, this is America. America has many unseen issues with its foundational structure. Okay, one such issue, a remnant of enslavement and Jim Crow apartheid here in America, though by laws passed have been dismantled, certain civil rights laws and, Voting Rights Act and all those things, their remnants has warped into the current multi-layered racial system we call racism today, okay? Not only psychologically, like I said in the first show, I used a quote by a black psychologist who said this, and I always remember it, that the experience of the first generation of people, like colonial times or during the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the Civil War, becomes the experience of that generation, okay? And that experience becomes the history of the next generation, their children and grandchildren. And the history of those events becomes, after multiple generations of learning this history, become the culture of that society. So if you are, even though people might say, well, why would you need to go back to that old stuff? Well, whatever was the experience when Jim Crow laws were put back in place after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, okay, when these white Confederate soldiers became the Ku Klux Klan or burnt down many of the great cities and towns that black people had established, trying to become this American citizen that the 14th Amendment set us in the 1870s and 1890s, but we had to deal with racism. And but generation after generation of white people and the laws that were established to give them that upper hand, okay, that caste system, and remind them today is part of their psyche and culture. You just don't change the law in 1965 or 64 with the Civil Rights Act and think you're going to change the culture of the people who threw rocks at Ruby Bridges, a young child that went to try to go to school, who's now in her 70s. But that iconic image of white they were conditioned by laws to believe that they were of a different caste. And how dare that person integrate? That's why you had white flight into the suburbs. That's why people will vote against their image. This is an image of, that's Ruby Bridge down the corner. Look at the visceral response of that. You think they were born that way? Or there were laws that conditioned them to believe that they were of a particular class and they were allowed into areas of society that black people were segregated out of. So if you're a child born there, these are teenagers, but they are conditioned, and these teenagers are now the grandparents that you see were on the line, the MAGA lines, going to see the current president. Okay, it's part of their culture. That's why you wonder why people are voting against their own issue when there was a black woman running for president. when you got conditioned to believe that from a young age, and you see how they're looking at this young black child, why you think it's not going to affect their unconscious cultural abilities to see a black woman in charge of the United States? Okay, they didn't want this child to go to school, but you're going to want a black woman to be in charge, and you're going to vote against your own interests. That's the acidity of the laws. Okay, let me get a full stream of me. I want to also emphasize this point. How many of you out there stop at a red light? Okay, we all do, but do you do it consciously? Now, when you first got your license, and you might be conscious of stopping, you see looking for red light, but after 15, 20 years, you don't even think twice. You could be talking to somebody next to you, and you are going to stop at that stoplight, okay? That's part of your cultural now. That's part of your social engineering by a law that was established 100 years ago, when or more, when cars were first put on the roads. Prior to that law being written for cars, people were riding horse-drawn carriages and horses and stuff like that. Totally different mentality. But by the time that law, 100 years later, everybody is culturally in tune to unconsciously function by stopping at that stoplight. A law does that to you because it conditions you to behave a certain way. What do you think black codes condition white populations when they're told that, no more than 5 people, there should be a white person there, questioning them, asking them what they're doing? That was one of the black codes that came after the Civil War. Not including, we ain't talking about the slave codes, okay? Where a white man could rape a black woman and won't be charged because she's property, all right? Where a law was challenged when Taney, Supreme Court Taney said that, here, this man is nothing but property, so he doesn't have any rights that a white person could survive, have to listen to. This was a law, okay, by a Supreme Court judge. These laws that are put on the books based on the people that were voted into office and their interests affects how you condition the society into the future. So if you're conditioned that you are always manifest destiny, you only see images of white people crossing the United States and settling in all these towns along the way. You didn't see images of people that look like me or native people that owned the land for 1,000 years. You are conditioned to believe a mythology of white supremacy. That's when we hear black people say white supremacy, they're talking about that. This is conditioned by a law. And who puts the law? You vote a person in, and his interests must coincide with the society that surrounds them. And if it's only for white society and white men who are in charge of the politics from the time of the colonial times, who you think is going to benefit from the type of laws that's going to affect us? It wasn't affecting us. It wasn't helping black folks or native people for hundreds of years. So when you saw Ruby Bridges and you saw the way that white crowd of young teenagers were acting, it's because they were conditioned by laws that were put in place before they were born. And that's what we were fighting in the 60s. Until we get this understanding right, and for those of you who didn't vote, you just gave them the right to put those laws back into place. What's going to do for our grandchildren and great-grandchildren who will follow us when these reintroduced racist segregation casting laws are put back on the books like people are trying to do right now. Hundreds of years before, since then, 60 or 70, 80 years before segregation laws were eliminated. This is how powerful a law is. Same law that makes you unconsciously stop at a stoplight that was produced 100 years ago. Social engineer you by your behaviors to stop. You don't even think twice about it. So when you see white people, Karens that they are called, walking up to a black person and asking what they're doing here, why you're here, or a cop looking at a black person at a traffic stop in a threatening way, why you're tense, and we react in tense because we know the history of America. Okay? We are tense by the thousands of people that were stopped by police officers and ended up dead, or lynched back in the early 1900s, or beat up because they were just sitting at a lunchroom table that was predominantly for whites only, or Rosa Parks going to jail by the law. And all these people were arrested or taken in by the people that we're always told there to protect and serve, because they have their cultural conditioning too. All right? So let's go on to the next slide. Let me continue our conversation. And as our past African-American ancestors had to deal with the actions of these evil twins, enslavement and Jim Crow apartheid, I always put apartheid there because that's what we had. America, please remember that we had an apartheid system. That's what Jim Crow was. No different than South Africa, okay? South Africans learned from the Americans. The Germans sent a delegation in 1930s to look at our Jim Crow apartheid system, and that they took whatever they learned and took back to Germany, where the Nazis implemented it. You know how they segregated and put the Jews into these ghettos and concentration camps. Okay, let's understand that where that information came from. We current people of African descent today still have to deal with the reconstituted version of racist social structures in its current state. That's what racism is. When we say racism, that's what we're talking about. We recognize it. People, when we say that you might be a white person that don't have a clue, that has the ability to go through life without having to deal with these blockages to their social order, okay? That's what privilege means. You had the privilege to be white, and these laws did not block you from going to a restaurant or getting to the back of the bus. You could go to the front. So in your reality, that's the American dream. That's the suburbia. That's making America great again. But it wasn't great for people like us or Native people. Let's go on to the next one. We still is a dangerous social environment we must all still face and fix as a nation, so that the whole of the society structure, the social structure of America, can start to truly function correctly. We ain't there yet, okay? Until the whole is able to do that. That's DEI, okay? That's what DEI was put up to try to bring us to that point. But guess what's happening? The same people that were teenagers that yelled at Ruby Bridges in that image that I showed, the young girl going to school, they're the 70-year-olds and 60-year-olds that are pushing out these laws that is banning that is banning DEI, bringing us back to the world where we could function as normal human beings and social citizens of the United States of America. White America doesn't have to deal with that thought. We have to deal with that as black people every day we walk out the door. That's the difference, two Americas. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Sad but true, this American system, racism, or this caste system, as I call it, that most Americans don't even want to face, has been essential to this building of the American structure. All Americans now occupy this American structure. All Americans now occupy. Just as the studs and joists we can't see is in a finished building we call our homes. Okay, America, the house we call America, a lot of this racism is built into the structure that you don't see on the outside. Okay, but because it's a 200-year-old house, it needs to be updated. We still need to get to those joists, do the electrical, and make sure that the planks and the floors are steady. Okay, America is an old house that needs work, And if you're the generation that occupies the management part or the mature part of the world, and you said, well, why do we have to do anything? Well, how many people walk into a house that's 200 years old without updating? America needs to be updated. That's what black Americans have been saying for generations and generations and generations. We got to update this if you're going to call yourself the America that is printed in us for the time we were children, the land of the free and the home of the brave. It's not the land of the free yet. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This structure, racism, was created by the early colonial laws of this land, which have now become the unconscious code of instruction that has maintained a 400-year-old hierarchical social order. That's what I'm talking about. The culture is embedded in your mind to stop at a red light. These laws that created this society, going back to colonial time, embedded racism because of white dominance was put into those laws. Let's go on to the next one. A system racism, which is an artificial construction of fixed and embedded ranking of human values, okay? A system racism set a presumed supremacy of one group of people in a society over another group of people. Okay, a system, racism, has kept a rigid and artificial boundary which for centuries has kept one group of people apart from another group based solely on artificial assumptions. Okay? We see it in the DEI nonsense about unqualified blacks, only because they occupy positions normally cause of racism kept by unqualified white males, who brought down in 2008 the financial issue, brought us into World War I and World War II that almost destroyed the United States and the rest of the world, or the atomic time. These are all white men, okay, who did this. But they're okay, all right? But a lot of the black people who invented things that benefited humankind have been relegated to 1 month in February called Black History Month. Okay, otherwise we are totally whitewashed from history. Even the ancient ones that look like us is whitewashed by the insidiousness of the social order who defied us in the sciences, you know, of archaeology and anthropology and all those things. They don't see that every movie I grew up with as a child, I saw white people, a woman that's that looked like supposed to be Cleopatra and Moses. But I'm gonna stop it there because I have more, but I could do on for 2 or 3 more shows. But I just wanted to end it here. Okay, this is a book that I want you to understand before I go. It says "We Return Fighting." This is about these black soldiers that were sent to fight in World War I, but when they had to come back to America, they had to continue to fight just for social justice. Okay, this is what America has been. It's always been divisive. Until then, peace, hotep, bye-bye.